Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. University presidents of the Gilded Age wielded enormous power. And I know people of today will probably think that the same is true of our time, that there's this sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of university presidents. You can think of Leon Botstein, Mordecai Johnson, Larry Summers, Bob Jones, Gordon Gee, and I'll let you put them into their respective boxes. But back in the Gilded Age, the presidents of universities saw the governance of their institution as being as significant to that of a state governor governing the state or a senator. Woodrow Wilson of Princeton would go on to become president of the United States, and Nicholas Murray Butler of Columbia would run for vice president and president, losing both times. Jacob Gould Sherman of Cornell was an important diplomatic ambassador. Charles Eliot of Harvard, David Starr Jordan of Stanford, G. Stanley Hall of Clark University, all of them had side hustles as public intellectuals and social commentators. And among this class of Gilded Age presidents of universities is the rather obscure Daniel Coit Gilman of Johns Hopkins University. Gilman had a really interesting career. He helped found the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale University and then served as the second president of the University of California, Berkeley, and then, as I mentioned, the first president of Johns Hopkins University. He also became the first president of the Carnegie Institute. So that's a pretty impressive CV, but there is so much more to discuss here, including, I think, the man's incredible facial hair. He's got these mutton chop whiskers that stretch the length of his face and neck, a little bit like Chester A. Arthur's. Today, I am speaking with one of the veterans of higher education leadership who knows more about Gilman than anyone else because he's just written a biography on the man. It's the president of Coastal Carolina University, Michael T. Benson, and the book is called Daniel Coit Gilman and the Birth of the American Research University. No better person to write this book than Mike Benson because he has worked in university administration for decades as president of Eastern Kentucky University, Southern Utah University, and Snow College. In addition, of course, to his latest position. And he has studied at Brigham Young University, Oxford University in the UK. He's played college basketball at both. He's a historian by training, and no doubt that has helped him write the biography, but probably, I think, I'm just speculating here, made him a better leader in higher education, which is something I would say, of course, but no doubt also true. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great to be with you.
So this is a university president writing about another university president, and I can't wait to get into this story because it's a fantastic one about Daniel Coit Gilman. But I'm going to take a detour because that's what you did in your book at the outset with the introduction. You take a detour. Gilman is, of course, the subject of the book. He's the president of Johns Hopkins University. But as the name of the university suggests, there's another person who made this an important institution. Tell us who Johns Hopkins is.
So very interesting, and I'm glad you start with that because, like many institutions right now, there's a process going on at Hopkins, and his first name Johns was his maternal great grandmother's maiden name. So sometimes people leave off that S, and it's important to remember that. I'm glad you got it right, Mike. So the Hopkins right now is going through what they're calling hard histories and looking at Johns Hopkins, who was a very devout Quaker, but he did have enslaved people in his household. People have called him an abolitionist. He was a supporter certainly of the Union Army, of the Union cause, was a confidant of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And if you've been to Baltimore, Baltimore is very much has a southern town feel to it, even though they think of themselves more of a seaboard community as opposed to the South where I live now in South Carolina. But Johns Hopkins came from a very large Quaker family. His parents came back from church one Sunday and said, "We are going to free all of our enslaved persons and put him to work in the fields." They had a large, in Arundel County, farming operation, grew cotton and other crops. And he never went to college and never had the opportunity to really get any formal education, and was sent off to Baltimore when he was 17, 18 years old, working for his uncle. and decided to break away and founded Hopkins and Brothers Dried Goods. And this is an interesting kind of wrinkle because he found the liquor trade was particularly profitable, and kind of the cross-state transport of spirits, which got him into trouble with this Quaker meeting, as they call it. That's their name for a congregation. And he was booted out of his meeting because of his trade in liquor. But he never married, had no heirs to speak of. And it's interesting, George Peabody, you'll appreciate him given the fact that you live over in the UK, arguably one of the greatest philanthropists in the history of the world, but what really was the first modern philanthropist of the 19th century. Did a tremendous amount in England where he lived, and also in Baltimore. The Peabody Institute is a spectacular facility and is connected to Johns Hopkins. But George Peabody is the one that convinced Johns Hopkins in the 1860s that he should leave his wealth to things that really mattered. And in his mind, he said, a university and a hospital. So Johns Hopkins put together through his friend, John Work Garrett, who was in effect, the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, where Hopkins made all of his money, was in the stock of the B&O. He also had a tremendous amount of land holdings in and around Baltimore. And John Work Garrett helped draft up a will, and the will divided evenly his estate of, think about $7 million in the 1860s. So $3.5 million was going to go to a university and $3.5 million to a hospital. And he died in 1873, either 1872 or 73, on Christmas Eve. And before he died, it was all spelled out exactly who the trustees were going to be for both the hospital and the university. And Daniel Coit Gilman comments, and I quoted in the book, that never in the history of American higher education, or maybe the world, had that much money been given with kind of unencumbered. There was no restrictions on how they were to spend it or to found the university. And I have worked in public higher education for 30 years. And anytime you get an unrestricted gift, you kind of leap in the air because those just do not happen. And so for him to trust his friends, and they were all friends, there were some family members that he appointed to the board as trustees, they took it and ran with it. And it is a remarkable story of their going out and hiring a president who then went out and recruited individually the 6 founding faculty members at Hopkins. And I don't mean to wax too more romantic about it, but it's an incredibly inspiring story when you think about how this set in motion American higher education philanthropy in the 1860s and 70s that led to what? You had Cornell University founded, you had Clark University, you had the Rockefellers found the University of Chicago, you had the Stanfords go all the way out to Palo Alto, where they were from, and found Stanford University. So this began in many ways a kind of this ripple effect of the first significant gift to higher education in America that had never been seen before. And that's Johns Hopkins. So the amazing thing too was the university got started. It was based on Baltimore and Ohio railroad stock, which kind of ebbed and flowed. And then he did the $3.5 million for the hospital, which was opened in 1889. And that was followed with the medical school. So I hope we have a chance to get into a little bit about the first teaching hospital in America, and the fact that the medical school was the most rigorous. If people want to get a medical degree in the 19th century, they did not stay in America. They went to Germany, they went to England, they went to France, particularly Germany. But the Hopkins model created a teaching hospital. And if you go on campuses today, whether it's here in our home state of South Carolina, if I go to USC, you see these enormous teaching hospitals and medical facilities. University of Michigan, for example, I've never seen a bigger one in this country. But think of all of the medical advances that have come out of Research One universities based on a model that was established in 1876 at Johns Hopkins. So that was a kind of a rambling preamble, but that's who Johns Hopkins was, a remarkable, philanthropist in his own right. And the university, of course, bears his name.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. And there's a lot more in the book as well. I think you starting with the hard histories is great, because there are moral dilemmas throughout his life that he has as well. But of course, the book isn't about Hopkins. It's about Daniel Coit Gilman, and this isn't his first rodeo, Johns Hopkins. So I was wondering, and I want to get to the other parts too, the medical school. I want to get to the English connection, but maybe if you could give us a sort of a short history of his life before he takes the helm of the university. What's his background?
Well, he was born in Norwich, Connecticut. That's where he's buried, right next to his first wife, Mary, who died very, very young in life, but was raised in New York City, and quite in all full transparency, kind of came from a life of privilege. His father was a very well-to-do merchant. He had not gone to university or graduated, and so he sent his son off to Yale, where a lot of kids from Connecticut were attending. And it's interesting, Michael, in the class of 1844 and 1845, I want to make sure I get my dates right. You had three friends. The first, of course, was Gilman. The other one was Andrew Dixon White, who became the first president of Cornell. And the other one was William Preston Johnston. And if you know your Civil War history, his father was Albert Sidney Johnston, who was the Confederate general who was shot in the back of the leg, right above his knee, and bled out in his boot at the Battle of Shiloh. And Jefferson Davis said that he believed that the Confederate cause was going to come to an end because he lost his best general. Of course, that didn't happen. We know about the Civil War, but after the Civil War, William Preston Johnston taught first at Washington College, which became Washington Lee, and then became the superintendent at LSU, and then the first president of Tulane. So think about this: in space of 2 years, Yale produces the first three founding presidents of Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and Tulane University. And after his graduation from Yale, like a lot of his contemporaries, he went off to Europe. Worked for the American consulate in Russia, but really spent quite a bit of time on his own with his friend Andrew Dixon White, investigating the educational systems throughout Europe. He was particularly fascinated with England and Germany. Those were the two that really held quite a bit of interest for him. So with the backing of his father and with doing a little bit of work here and there, he was a prolific letter writer. That was one thing I loved, was getting into the correspondence back and forth with his parents, with his friends, with his siblings. He had very close relations with his sisters, and confided in them that here's a young man at age 24, 25, who had a very kind of marked sense of what was in store for him, and not knowing exactly what that path or where that path would take him. Was always focused on preparing and learning as much as he could. And he kept he's a prodigious writer, and he would keep these notebooks of observations and connections. And one thing I really loved, anytime you do a project like this, oftentimes you get transported back to that time just by reading the correspondence. And he would spend days, and he would keep a catalog of the letters he wrote back and forth. And one year he wrote, I think, 320 letters in 1 year. And beautiful penmanship and very elaborate salutations. And they used letterpress books to make copies of many of this correspondence. And to the credit of Johns Hopkins Library, the Eisenhower Library there on campus in Baltimore, they've digitized a lot of this. So to the listeners, if you want a fun little kind of escape and maybe go down the rabbit hole, hop on their website and read some of these letters, because you name prominent people, educators, business leaders, politicians in the latter part of the 19th century, chances are Gilman had some type of correspondence with them.
So I didn't take you up on that offer to go and read the digital, but I was really fascinated by, you had mentioned that when he was in Manchester, he spoke with Richard Cobden. He was there giving a talk. And I said to my friend, Mark Palin, who he's written about Cobden extensively, that he had no idea that Gilman had this connection with Cobden, or that Gilman had this epiphany, I suppose, during the European tour.
Yeah, and the Cobden episode is really interesting because they get to London. He's invited to this meeting in Manchester, I believe it was, and it's in effect a labor meeting. And Andrew Dixon White, and Gilman are invited. And Andrew Dixon White was a very capable, read his life story. He had this extensive library that he started collecting when he went off to Europe, but he was not nearly the public speaker that Gilman was. And so he said, Gilman was given the assignment of speaking to this meeting. And he gets up there and Dixon White records that he was so impressed by his young friend who literally gets up there and in front of a crowd of, close to 1,000 people, elucidates on the topic that he's given. Those kinds of relations. I'm so glad you brought that up because these were not just superficial, one-offs. He got to know these people. He kept these relationships going throughout his life, and you read that in the correspondence. And he did it everywhere he went, whether it was in Germany or in England or he did a tour through the Middle East during one of his sabbatical years at Johns Hopkins, utilizing all the contacts he had of people taking him through Jerusalem or through Cairo or through Istanbul. It's really fascinating. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh, that's great. Tell me, so before he comes to Johns Hopkins, what's his big break in higher education?
So he goes back to Yale. And if you look at American higher education in the 19th century, they were still very much on this model of the schools, particularly the Ivy League schools, that were focused on three areas: teaching, law, and divinity, in effect. So if you had hard sciences, anything in the area of engineering or chemistry or physics, they were housed in a wholly different, oftentimes a different campus. So at Yale, it was called the Sheffield Scientific School. At Harvard, for example, it was the Lawrence Scientific School. So he gets a job first as the librarian, assistant librarian at Yale, not the Sterling Library that you see today, but much more humble circumstances or edifice at that time, but really becomes committed to an educational experience in America that melded the liberal arts, the traditional liberal arts, with the scientific disciplines, what you may call the applied sciences, which they were called at the time, and really became committed to ensuring that those were not mutually exclusive, but that universities were built on a model where you could study both. And one did not necessitate ignoring the other. So he does that for a while. His reputation grows quite considerably. Here's another relationship, becomes very good friends with Justin Morrill, the senator from Vermont, and is really the primary reason that Yale is designated as the land-grant institution of the state of Connecticut. So a lot of people think about, well, in South Carolina, for example, Clemson's the land-grant. In Texas, it's Texas A&M, and at Louisiana, it's LSU. You had three private schools on the East Coast that convinced the federal government that they should be considered a land grant, and got that, in effect, land grant script that created these enormous endowments to fund education at MIT, at Cornell, and at Yale. Yale eventually had to cede to a legislative demand in the 1890s. The University of Connecticut became the land-grant institution. So as Gilman is doing all these things, his reputation is now starting to grow, and he gets recruited to be the president at the University of California, the first president. His wife had recently passed away. His oldest daughter, was not well physically, so he turned down the offer. He really, in full disclosure, he wanted to be the president of Yale, his alma mater, and they went with another candidate. He kind of went into a funk in his life a little bit. Think about your own life, or think about my life. Your spouse dies, you're all by yourself, you have two daughters to raise, you don't get your dream job. So California comes calling again, and he thinks this is maybe my chance to break out. And his daughter had a respiratory challenge, and so the doctor said maybe the climate out in California would be better. So, parenthetically, I should add, it was easier to get from New Haven, Connecticut to London, England, than it was to get from New Haven to Berkeley, California. And he takes a train, Michael, all the way out to Berkeley, to Oakland, to do and kind of his own investigation of the opportunity. They offer him the job, and he becomes the third president of the University of California in 1872. And, he has a fairly successful tenure, but he runs headlong into what they call the Grange out there in California, the people that were committed to two things. They wanted applied science taught, they call it the mechanical arts and agriculture. And so here was this kind of well-born, well-bred Brahmin from Connecticut coming out there and telling them that they needed to focus on the liberal arts and make sure the literature and English and music and philosophy were taught. And you had the kind of the native population there that was saying, hey, we got this Moral Land Grant Act money, and we're going to focus on building our economy and our infrastructure, and that's going to be the sciences, that's going to be agriculture, that's going to be mechanical arts, that's going to be engineering. And he was not used to dealing with the legislature either. So it was a tough kind of row to hoe for him. And when his best friend, Andrew Dixon White, sent him a letter and said, hey, I'm hearing overtures that there's been this enormous gift set aside by a gentleman by the name of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, that's when he started kind of listening. So in 1875, he makes a trip back out from Oakland back out to New Haven and spends an entire day with the board, and they offer him on the spot the job at Hopkins. And last point I'll say, the trustee at Hopkins asked the presidents of Michigan, James Angel, the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, and the president of Cornell, Andrew Dixon White, whom should they select to be the first president of Johns Hopkins? And to a person, they said, your guy is out there in California. His name is Daniel Coit Gilman. So in effect, by acclamation, they offered him the job, and he accepted it on the spot. And he started in February of 1876.
And what does Johns Hopkins look like in 1876? I mean, Reconstruction is, well, it's the very tail end of Reconstruction. What does it look like? I mean, what does admissions look like? What are the plans for admissions look like? What is the plan for, the schools to be? Is it liberal arts or what does it look like?
That's a good question, and it's hard to kind of transport yourself back to Baltimore post Civil War. It was still very much a southern state. It was kind of betwixt and between in many ways. And I mentioned John Warren Garrett, the president of the Baltimore and Ohio, who started off as kind of a supporter of the Confederacy. And then when they did damage to his trains, when I say they, I'm trying to remember who the Confederate general was. I think it was Longstreet, who damaged a lot of his rails at Harper's Ferry. He said, no, that's it. Okay, I'm now a Union man. And he became very close with Ulysses S. Grant and President Lincoln. So in some ways, Baltimore was still trying to figure out where it fit in Reconstruction. And so for a gift to happen from Johns Hopkins in 1869 is when he put his will together, and then it come to fruition 1872, 1873. It was very modest. I mean, if you look at the original kind of buildings, the joke, and I mentioned it in my book, people would take the trolley by the buildings that were the chemistry and some of the science buildings, and they were very, very modest. And one person quipped that, what is that, a piano factory? And that was the original campus in downtown Baltimore. And one person said they've got millions of dollars for research and not one penny for show. And Gilman stated unequivocally, he said, we are about men and not buildings. And you may say, well, that's very sexist, but the faculty he hired were all men, of course. We can maybe get into a discussion about the admission of women, which didn't happen on the undergraduate level until in the 1970s. So they did admit a few women very selectively in the 1870s, and there were conditions to that, but just for graduate school. So if you think about the faculty he recruited, even the graduate students he recruited, many of whom had come from these bucolic settings along the East Coast with quads and beautiful chapels and leafy greens and all that sort of thing. And here they are in downtown gritty Baltimore. And it wasn't until the 1920s that they moved to what's the present site of the Homewood campus. So it was very, very kind of Spartan. And whatever resources they had, Gilman put into people, and he put into fitting out their lab equipment and fitting out their labs. And that was his number one priority.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up admissions, not just for women, but I also want to talk about minorities as well, because in the book you point out that California had allowed female undergrads when Gilman was president of Berkeley, but Hopkins didn't. But they do admit African Americans, right? I mean, how did the admissions policies work specifically around those two groups?
So in my book, I take an entire chapter on the California tenure. And as he's leaving, he presents to the Board of Regents basically a 50 or 60 page synopsis of his tenure. And one of the things he's most proud of is that women were admitted on the same level with the same requirements as men. And he states very kind of unashamedly that the female students were better students than the males. And that so California was in many ways far advanced of some of the East Coast schools. Now, Cornell admitted female students early on. I came from Kentucky, where you had down the road from our college at Eastern Kentucky, Berea College, which in the 1850s was coeducational and had African American students, which was unheard of in the South, as you can appreciate. So California, in many ways, was I think a harbinger of what he wanted to do at Hopkins, but in point of fact, he ran into real stiff opposition from board members. And the irony, Michael, is that there were four board members that had four daughters, all of whom who wanted to go to Hopkins, and none of them were admitted. So they went other places. It wasn't until, and you mentioned admission of an African American student, Kelly Miller. He was the first and really the only one. And one thing they did at Hopkins that had never been tried before was they set aside money for stipends, in effect, scholarships or fellowships. And nobody had been willing to pay graduate students to study postgraduate or pursue postgraduate degrees. And so one commentator said Hopkins basically went out and bought the best people they could. And that's true. I mean, if you want to distill down why they were successful, these $500 stipends covered everything for these students that wanted to come and study. And Kelly Miller, who had come from Washington, D.C., maintained that his funding ran out. You know, if Hopkins really wanted to keep him, they could have. You know, it's maybe easy for us to armchair quarterback all these years later, but I point out in the book that they could have really had a chance. In so many ways they let out, and in so many ways they were innovators that nobody had seen before in higher education. And for a southern state like Maryland to fully admit African American students, other minority students, and females in the 1870s and 80s would have really been something. You know, what might have been. I can't opine on that anymore, other than to say the historical record is what it is. Howard Kelly went on to do extraordinary things at Howard University in Washington, D.C. They called him the Bard of the Potomac. He was a prolific writer, and he wasn't bitter. But I often ask, what could have happened if Hopkins had said, "Hey, we will be different," and the board just kind of dug in. And Gilman tried, but you know, he was a prolific journal keeper on many subjects, but on this one, he remains somewhat eerily silent on the admission of African American students at Hopkins. The last thing I'll point out is he was the part of the Slater Fund, the John Fox Slater Fund, and chairman of the board on that board for nearly 25 years. And that was a very successful mercantilist from Norwich, his hometown, who tried to fill that gap of post-Reconstruction when Reconstruction in so many ways failed the freedmen, the freed emancipated slaves, and didn't provide the educational opportunities that they had promised. And so what did you have? You had rich benefactors that came from the East and try to establish, whether it's the Peabody Fund or the Rockefellers, or in this case, John Fox Slater, and funded quite a bit of HBCUs that now run through the South where we now live.
Well, you point out that he was appointing people to the faculty that were really the best in their class too. And I was wondering if you could take us through some of the people that he appointed and some of the programs that they developed at Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, so he went out, and I don't think there's another example of a university president spending the time of not only resources but commitment to recruit his original 6 faculty. So classicists, chemists, the gentleman he recruited from Oxford had came from kind of that traditional English background. He got arguably the finest mathematician of his generation, and then he hired his first doctor, William Welch, who then was responsible for going out and recruiting the original, what they call the big four, the 4 doctors. So William Welch was a pathologist. He recruited Howard Kelly, who was a gynecologist. He also recruited Sir William Osler, who left Hopkins and was knighted and became professor of medicine at his back in his home country at Oxford. And then arguably the finest surgeon of his generation, William Stewart Halsted. And there's been, I don't know if you watched The Nick on HBO or Showtime several years ago, but based on him, a remarkable surgeon who tragically was a morphine and cocaine addict for about 30 years of his life. Had tried cocaine as a local anesthetic in a surgery in the 1870s, 1880s. And some of his residents tried it as well, and they all became addicted. So they tried to wean him off of cocaine with morphine. And you think about what he was able to do. And I don't have time to go into some of the things that he did, but one good example, he married a woman named Carolyn Hampton, who ironically was the granddaughter of Wade Hampton here in South Carolina, the Confederate general, who was a nurse in New York City. And he was a stickler for cleanliness in his surgical space, in his lab. And so I don't know what kind of acid it was, but he required everybody to scrub in and use this acid to clean their hands. And it was destroying her skin, Carolyn Hampton's skin. And she said, look, unless you come up with a different way, I'm not doing this anymore. So after that particular procedure, he goes down the street in New York and meets with his friends at Goodyear Tire and Rubber and has them develop the very first set of plastic gloves that had a thing they could kind of cordon off at the wrist, tie off at the wrist. And he takes them back to Carolyn and says, well, this worked. And she puts them on, and that was the start of surgical rubber gloves that now are just de rigueur. I mean, you see them everywhere, but things like that. I mean, the fact that he did emergency gallbladder surgery on his mother on the kitchen table. He saved his sister's life, who was dying in childbirth, by giving her a blood transfusion from his own arm. I mean, he did things that were just unheard of. And it was that kind of talent that Gilman recruited, the classicists, the chemists, the historians. They all came to Hopkins because there was the allure of study was the primary focus. There wasn't politics to speak of. This was a brand new university with an absolutely clean slate. And the idea was you were going to be expected to do your best work, and you were going to be supported. And if you look at the production of PhDs, for example, in that first 25 years of existence, the number, I have it in the book, it's north of 500. And Harvard produced, I think, 150 during that same period. And the president of Harvard said it wasn't until Hopkins kind of spurred us forward and showed us what was possible that we finally got our act together with our graduate school. And so, I'm getting far afield there, but the fact that Hopkins was able to produce that many degrees does not suggest at all that they were easy. These were rigorous programs, and I go through the kind of the things that were codified in terms of the American PhD, the use of external examiners, for example, publication of theses, not 2 years, but 3 years between the time where you finished your undergraduate degree and when you got a doctorate. The fact that you had to have a principal or a primary area of focus, but also a secondary. So all these things that we kind of take for granted that were codified by, interestingly enough, the Association of American Universities, founded by Gilman and his colleagues in 1901, that was adopted as kind of the PhD requirements in American higher education today. That in many ways has been replicated by other systems in other countries around the world.
I mean, I could delve into a few more. I was thinking when I was reading the book about the Flexner report coming out of Johns Hopkins. I mean, that transforms medicine for generations in the United States, and there's others as well. But presidents, when they're conceiving a vision for an institution and executing that vision, they often meet with opposition from those that either resist the change or have a competing point of view about where the institution is going to go. How did Daniel Coit Gilman deal with opposition in Johns Hopkins?
So that's a really good question, and it's not that he didn't have any, because the challenge was that it was established ostensibly as a graduate school, and the primary kind of tranche of students that came in were all graduate students. So you can go through the roster, and they published what were called university circulars. In effect, it was an annual report, but they did it more regularly than annually. It was more like quarterly and sometimes monthly. And they would have a list of all the people they recruited as students, and they were expensive. I mean, as I mentioned, $500 was not an inconsequential amount of money back in 1876. So at a certain point, as I mentioned, the ebb and flow of the B&O railroad stock impacted their annual budget. They realized they had to go out and get undergraduate students to help pay the bills. So it's not dissimilar to what we face in higher education today. I mean, you have to kind of take from Paul to pay Peter, as they say. And so he ran into some opposition as to the focus on graduate students. Maybe they should focus more on the undergraduate experience. He was very actively involved in community service and board service throughout his life. He loved to travel. As I mentioned, he went across the Atlantic Ocean more often than people ever dreamed of in 19th century America. And there were some that kind of criticized that he wasn't around very much. He kind of left to other people the running the university when he was out, kind of gallivanting around the continent and advising people. He was looked to by many people as a not only experienced but incredibly insightful. So I don't know if we'll have a chance to get into the Andrew Carnegie himself recruiting him to run his Washington Institute when he retires from Hopkins. So that's an example of the fact that his reputation really crossed over into business, into philanthropy, into a lot of other areas. So, if there was opposition, I think it was that 25 years at a place is a long time, but a lot of time away from campus doing things that he found were of interest to him, and where he felt like he could help. Good example. In the southern part of Virginia, Williamsburg, Virginia, is the oldest public institution in our country, College of William and Mary. And after the Civil War, it's absolutely devastated. They've closed the doors. The president there invites Gilman for a tour of campus. So Gilman comes there with a second wife and his daughter, and he's absolutely bowled over by how bad it is. The building there, named for the British architect, his name escapes me. Wren, Christopher Wren, the oldest academic building in America on that campus. And it's in terrible disrepair. And Gilman is so moved by how bad it is, he comes back to Hopkins and enlists his faculty to help support, not only with their own finances, but to lobby the Virginia General Assembly to support this fledgling institution that was literally making payroll because the president, who had no students, or had very few students rather, was paying his faculty out of his own pocket. And the state assembly, the General Assembly in Virginia, finally appropriates some money. And look at William and Mary today. I mean, had Gilman not kind of stepped in and helped. So that's an example of how he was enlisted to help here and help there. And if there was opposition, it was hey, pay more attention to the school that really that pays your bills. He was also very involved. Of course, he was the first director of the hospital in 1888, 1889. And then the establishment of the medical school. So
I think you're right, though, about presidents having a reach beyond their institution. Too often they're looked at as, just sort of the steward of their institution. But and Daniel Coit Gilman is a really good example, too. I mean, you mentioned the Carnegie Institute, and I want to delve into that a little bit here. But also maybe when we talk about the Carnegie Institute, can we also talk about how Gilman shaped higher education policy throughout the country as well, and about how, what he did at Hopkins, it also reflected in other institutions, what they decided to do with research funding and with developing programs.
So there's a bit in the book where I talk about George Washington and some of the original founders wanting to found a national university. That was one of the primary areas of focus for Washington. Obviously he had never gone to college. Very few of the founding fathers had gone. John Adams is really the exception. Thomas Jefferson, Adams at Harvard, Jefferson at University of Virginia, first at William and Mary, then Virginia. And so Andrew Carnegie, who was, you look at philanthropy in America, there's never been anyone quite like him, that he gave away so much of his wealth. And as you know, his primary focus first was libraries, 1,400 libraries in North America. We used to live out in Utah, and in our very small community in central Utah in Sanpete County, within about a 15-mile radius, and it was linear. It was 1, 2, 3 Carnegie libraries that were everything to those farming communities. I mean, they were the window to the world. And that's one example. And you can go throughout our country and see, remnants of Carnegie libraries. In many ways, they've been repurposed. Go to Washington, D.C., the new Apple store in D.C. is an old Carnegie library. And they spared no expense to save some of the original architecture. But think about that. I mean, the fact that this incredibly wealthy man, the world's wealthiest man at the time, did that, and then he was convinced by Andrew Dixon White, interestingly enough, to found this institution that, short of a national university, and there were some people that were pushing to put a national university in Washington D.C. that would be focused on research. Gilman's argument was, you already have these other universities established. Why reinvent the wheel? Why not support the research that's going on at these other places? And so when Carnegie recruits him to be the first president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington was the original name. The primary focus was to fund the research pockets that were going on at other places. And to your point, there was a colleague of his by the name of John Shaw Billings, who is another one of those unsung heroes, I believe, in the story. From Indiana, was a field surgeon for the Union Army during the Civil War. Cold Harbor, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Antietam. There's a picture of him before the war and when he was released for medical reasons, and his face is drawn, and you just imagine the experiences he had. But he was an amazing organizer, and he was the one that put together the medical library for the U.S. Surgeon General the first time in the 1860s and 70s. And he was recruited by Gilman to help with the establishment of first the hospital and then the medical school. And then he became very, very involved in the Carnegie Institution. And before he became involved with the Carnegie, he's the one that built the New York City Public Library. So he put to the Astor collection, and I can't remember the other names of it, but built right there in central Manhattan, what is considered probably the finest public library maybe in the world. And his portrait's upstairs in the main reading room. And that's another example of the talent that Gilman was able to recruit to various projects, first at Hopkins, then to the hospital and the medical school, and then to the Carnegie Institution. And he was one of the ones that took over for Gilman after Gilman realized that his vision maybe didn't coalesce with some of the other board members. And you look at the original board, I don't have the names in front of me, but it was the who's who of government and philanthropy and education in America in the early part of the 19th century, the 20th century. And it was great fun going back and reading the minutes of those meetings, because, here's Carnegie with literally unlimited wealth saying, I want to do this. And the Carnegie Institute today is still one of the primary funders of some really significant research across the world in really fundamental research that's impacting our lives on a daily basis.
So President Benson, with that hat on, the president's hat on, what has the book taught you about university management?
That's, not a day goes by that I don't think about the investment that Gilman made personally in recruiting the very best faculty he could. And he said time and again that the core of any great university, it's not the facilities. Yes, it's good students, but you have to have an exceptional faculty. And the thing I loved about Gilman is that he went out and recruited the best he could find, and he gave them the tools to do their job, and then he got the hell out of the way. And that's, I mean, to me, that's kind of the core of the academic enterprise. It's academic freedom. It's the ability to hire really outstanding people who are expert in their respective fields and let them do their thing. And
can I just say that I can currently hear all of the academic listeners to this podcast cheering, clapping, shouting, yes, right on.
And what was so amazing, Michael, is that Gilman, by the way, I didn't mention how the genesis of this book. And the genesis is I went to Hopkins in 2017 and asked for a one, single volume biography of Gilman. And it just so happened that there was an archivist there. And I tell the story in the preface, I believe, who said, well, when no one's written one in 50 years, you may as well take a shot at it. And I thought, I just had the temerity to think I could do it, or the chutzpah. And I'm so glad I did, because the story had to be told of what one visionary who was incredibly articulate and had this incredible power of rhetoric, but then turned rhetoric into results. It's one thing to get up and give a great speech. And his 1876, February 23rd inaugural speech, Michael, is the gold standard of presidential inaugurals. And I encourage everybody who's listening to this to look it up, because when Hopkins turned 125 years, it was called Knowledge for the World. They did this big coffee table book, and they took 12 principles or tenets or kind of aspirational goals that Gilman touched on. And in that book, they showed, lo and behold, they had accomplished every single one of them. So it's one thing to get up and give a great talk, but it's quite another to turn that into results. And he was not about lip service. He was about, look, I'm going to go find the best. I'm going to let them do their thing. And what it produced was amazing results. So, there was and I'll end with this. I think in 1925, a sociologist did a study of the 1,000 top scientists in America. And if memory serves, it was 241 that were from Johns Hopkins. So they came out of this kind of nascent university from 1876 that had, Harvard had a 240-year head start on them, and produced these amazing scientists that then went out and populated universities across the world, in effect. And I think they took I hope they took a bit of Gilman with them, that the academic enterprise is about supporting faculty in their endeavors. And when you do that, wonderful things can happen. And that's exactly what happened to Hopkins.
Well, President Benson, that is a great way to wrap things up. And I just want to say as well, a couple of things. One, having a historian as a president, I think, is a great thing for your university. Not just a historian, I would say that as a fellow historian, but someone who's actively researching, writing, and publishing. And naturally, one that dovetails nicely with the work that you do anyway. But also for anyone listening, President's enthusiasm for this subject is kind of contagious. It comes out in the writing, it comes out in this conversation, and I'm very grateful that you could join us for the show.
Well, Michael, you've been so incredibly generous. And if I can just give you a 60-second synopsis of the campus where we are today at Coastal Carolina, because we started as Conway College in 1954. And it's an example of the townspeople in Horry County, which is the biggest county in South Carolina, getting together and saying, we're business, we're farmers, we're merchants. We don't know how to run a college, but we know our community wants one. And so in 1954, 15 people got together and put in their own money and founded what has now become, we were a branch of the University of South Carolina until 1993. And so we're coming up on our 75th anniversary. And that's an example of a local population recognizing the absolute value, the collateral impact that a college, a university, a higher education entity has on the quality of life in the community. It's not just, the payroll and the jobs we provide. It's the cultural events. It's the academic offerings. It's the sporting events. It's bringing together a community. So in many ways, I'm living in a microcosm, a much smaller scale of what happened in Baltimore in 1876. And if you went across this country, your job at Dickinson, I don't know its history, but my guess is you'd find more often than not histories about local communities saying, we want a college, we want a university, we want a trade tech, we want a community college in our community, because we realize how incredibly valuable they are.
Well, I can pretty much guarantee that the president of my institution who listens to this podcast is also nodding his head in agreement. The importance of universities to communities, and particularly ones like Dickinson State, where it's a rural place, and so the importance of the university is even greater there. Mike, thank you so much for joining the show.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.